Cassandra Eve of Whole Woman, and this is the next and the final video interview in my Conscious Conversations series, which comes from my book. Here it is, Sacred Pathways, Discovering Divine Feminine Archetypes in You. And today we are exploring Pallas Athena, the warrior goddess of wisdom. I prefer to see her as creative feminine intelligence. So we're going to unpack her gifts and shadows. So today I have with me Lynn Hanford-Day, who is an artist and a coach. So welcome, Lynn.
Hi, Cassandra. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's really good to have this conversation because I know from my experience with you and knowing what you've done through your working life in particular, that Athena is a strong archetype for you. She is for all of us, actually. She is woman out in the world, whatever that means. So vocation, your relationship out in the world, your position in the world, and how we activate that, how we express that. So Athena, Pallas Athena, as she's also known, is an archetype from the Greek world, from the Greek mythology. And she is known as the wisdom goddess or the war goddess. She's seen as a warrior archetype. But of course, you know, if you're into the mythology, or if you're reading or have read my book, you'll understand that often the archetypal energies that were from the Greek culture are imposed over or superimposed over kind of original goddess archetypes. And Athena to them, we'll look at that through this video. Athena to the Greeks was a warrior goddess of wisdom, but more than that, she also was the patron or the guardian of the city of Athens. So the name Athens comes from her name. She was also the guardian of the artisans and the healers, guardian of the people in general, and she is known through her mythology as friend to heroes. So she could see through her intelligence different aspects of their quest that maybe they couldn't see with their more masculine, goal-orientated intelligence. So we're going to start. I'm just going to ask you, Lynn, what does that mean to you? You know, that warrior, that combination of warrior and wisdom. How have you seen that playing out in your life?
I really relate to it. It resonates. I've known for many years that I have a strong warrior woman within me, and she kind of very much becomes present through my corporate life. You know, I've worked in human resources at senior level for over 30 years. So she's often there to protect and be the conscience and to fight for justice and so on. But there's another side of me which I think's really kind of emerged in the last 8 or 9 years, where I'm far more interested in art and creativity and the healing elements, interested in beauty. So what's coming through to me is the creative aspects of Athena. The combination of the two can be, cause a bit of tension sometimes for me.
Absolutely. And she's a complex archetype, and if we look at her birth, we can see, you know, where that's rooted, where that complexity is rooted. So if you think about the original mother goddesses, that she's rooted in the Minoan goddesses, the snake goddesses. She's also rooted in the Amazon warrior archetypes, the warriors of Eastern Europe and Asia, horsewomen, fighters, and also in some of the more ancient Egyptian goddesses. But in the Greek mythology, she was born from her father's head. So one of his consorts was Metis, Athena's mother. But he had had a prediction, Zeus, that one of his children would overthrow him. So when Metis became pregnant, he actually made her very, very small, and then he swallowed her. And she literally was inside him. And for me, that's symbolic of how the patriarchy at that time was literally swallowing the mother energy, the goddess energy. But anyway, all was to be revealed further, because just in swallowing Metis, he didn't really know what he was setting in motion, because one day he had the most enormous headache. And he said to one of his servants, "Cleave open my head with your axe," which seems a bit drastic really for a headache, but nonetheless we're talking about, you know, Mount Olympus here in the realm of the gods and goddesses. So that's what happened. You know, his head was cleaved open, and from his head appeared Athena, clad in golden armor, with a shield and a spear and a helmet, and she was fully formed as a goddess. You know, she was a woman form. She wasn't a child. So she was seen traditionally as a supporter of her father, because she was born from her father. She was seen as that patriarchal supporter, and many feminists have suggested, you know, that she's a woman who will align with the men. And her stories, her mythology about supporting the Greek heroes kind of moved towards that as well. But that was forgetting her roots in the matriarchy, her roots in the ancient goddesses. So as I've explored her, I've seen that potentially she shows women how we have to, or we're called to, engage intellect, rationale, logic, you know, to be in that more goal-directed patriarchal world, and to evolve in that along with the deeper goddess aspects, the more traditional, nurturing, supportive, mother kind of energies, receptive. So Athena was very close to her father. She didn't always agree with him, and she didn't always follow what he suggested she should, but nonetheless, she was very close to him. So for women particularly, that brings in an exploration of what is, or what was the relationship with father. So was father a strong influence in your life, in your world?
I was always very close to my dad. As a child, I remember being called Daddy's girl, and I never knew what that really meant. But as I became a teenager, my relationship with my mum really deteriorated. And throughout my adult life, we had an appalling relationship. And at the time of her dying, we'd been estranged for 9 years.
Wow.
Which was my decision. I decided I couldn't tolerate her any longer. I had a very different experience of my dad, who died 2 years ago. I was with him when he died, and I always knew that he loved me, whereas the doubt was, you know, from my mum's behaviour, I was very confused as to why does she treat me like she hates me. So as a model, my mum, I would say, was the warrior. She taught me more about masculinity, I think, than my dad did. My dad was very passive, and she saw him as a weak man because he would not fight her or with her. And he literally left the room. So he was a very quiet person. She belittled him a lot, but I guess what I experienced of him looking back on all of this is a man who perhaps had more of the feminine going on within him than a person you'd describe as a patriarch. He wasn't that for me at all. And I suppose what I carry within me as a result of both, the combination of both of them, is the quieter element to me, the more thoughtful element, the more considered element. Whereas with my mum, there is the fighter.
Yeah.
I guess the wisdom bits is the integration of both of those things, and to develop the discernment of choosing when one or other may be more appropriate, but to actually live in the harmony of the mix of all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, for me, that alignment, you know, that discernment, that capacity to discern, when do I stand up and fight for something that's right and true and authentic for me, and when do I sit more in the quieter space? You know, that comes from an alignment of knowing what my values are, what's important to me, or what's perhaps important to others that I'm protecting. That's more of an Artemis energy, actually. But Athena is about being, as we'll discover through the video, her creative intelligence is about understanding, not just fighting for fight's sake, but the implications of our fight as well. And that's where the wisdom lies as well. So it's that capacity for me to stand strong in love, and to own what I'm fighting about, rather than, you know, a lot of what we see now is pushing it out there and saying it's their fault, you know, rather than purely referring to what's being experienced inside myself, you know, knowing what's true. So I'm going to read a little bit from the book now about Athena intelligence that will help to broaden our understanding of what I'm calling creative feminine intelligence. And it brings in the evolution of our intelligence as well. So we go way back to kind of come to the roots of it. At the times of the hunter-gatherer people, men and women had vastly different functions. Man was the hunter. He had a specific goal that ensured the survival of the tribe, to catch and bring home the food. Men worked both alone and in teams to achieve this task. The honor of being the one to make the kill ensured also that each man was acting both alone and as a team member in pursuit of the goal. Teamwork and competition worked side by side. We can see this same play in our world now. It's much as a game of football, isn't it? We might see it in the boardroom or the stock market. It seems we've evolved, yet perhaps not. The current focus may not be driven by physical survival, but it's still on competition and winning. It's still on making a killing. Whilst men were hunting, women tended the hearth, gathering and cooking food, and looked after the tribe's children communally. They were the caretakers. They may well have assumed other roles, as with the men. Cave paintings suggest a sacred connection to nature and the animal kingdom. We would call that shamanism. Ancient goddess figures suggest veneration of the female form was part of the culture too. Nonetheless, in the more survival-orientated aspects of life, men and women held differing roles. When we consider the caretaking role or relating, its obvious goal focus has no place. A different aptitude is required when tending the children, watching the fire, gathering plants and herbs, cooking the meal, whilst also listening for subtle nuances that suggest conflict, or being aware of potential danger approaching the group's shelter. Here we see holistic intelligence at play. We might also call that multitasking, which, you know, seems to be more of a female trait, but who knows? Holistic intelligence is spatial, subtle, aware. It's tuned into people and levels of connectedness, and it's open to signals within the environment that indicate a vast array of potentials. Much like a web, this intelligence operates at a center, the individual, and on its threads, radiating out through people and the environment, touching everything lightly and aware of the smallest signals. At that time, it activated and expressed an instinctual response or reaction. It still does so now, even though we've apparently become more evolved. In the everyday world of human beings now, we might call this quality intuitive perception, and it's linked to our survival response. A fairly obvious one is the skill of multitasking, the capacity to manage multiple strands of expression and action, yet it is so much more. So when I talk about creative feminine intelligence, I'm talking about that in a man or a woman, just as I'm talking about goal-focused directional intelligence in a similar way. It can be in either gender, but the two for me are vastly different. One is, future orientated. The goal is there. We can see how that evolved from the hunt. We're going out to collect, catch the woolly mammoth or whatever it was. But it discounts the periphery. It discounts the potential implications for everything else on the web of life. Whereas for me, creative intelligence is more like a web, so it works peripherally as well. And in terms of the goal, when both are balanced, we're aware of the implications of our goal and our steps towards our goal. And that may change our goal. It may change the timing. It may not. But it's a much more holistic form of intelligence that understands we are part of the web of life, not just one individual in it asserting its right to go for what it wants. So we can see, how that plays. So in your world, in your life, particularly in the working world, can you see how you've danced with both those? Because I know you've worked in the corporate world, now you're still perhaps involved in that corporate world, but in a very different way as a coach and an artist. So how has that played for you over your lifetime? What have you learned from that?
Yeah, it's really, really resident. I think it's no coincidence that I spent most of my career working in change management, and I've been described as a systems thinker, and also this ability to kind of connect the dots. So looking at everything that's in play beyond the actual desired change, we want to go from A to B. My capacity to kind of step back and see the whole and the totality, the thing that is greater than the sum of its parts, and to kind of guide organizations through the entirety of something, because a change in one part will affect something somewhere else, which can be unexpected or unforeseen. I've often been described as very, very intuitive, and I think it's the capacity for me to analyze and examine systems from a kind of very rational place, plus my felt sense of what's going on. So I'm often seen as a weather vane that I can tap into the mood of a group or the actual mood of an entire organization, and from that to make recommendations on timing, the right timing of things and actions that are taken. I'm just fascinated by the cosmos in general, so hence my interest in astrology. So there's something that's always taken me above and beyond a kind of narrow focus on something. So whilst I can be goal focused and kind of future focused and anticipate the future, my ability to translate that back into the here and now. So what that means in terms of the next step. I don't plan in detail. I'm not a project manager. Someone else needs to do that. But it's more to do with looking at the horizon, you know, seeing beyond today and the end of this next week. And I think it's no coincidence that I've worked in human resources, which is actually a very process-based kind of profession. A lot of people think it's about people. Unfortunately, it isn't. It's very process-based. But once we get into changing the culture of organisations and leadership, then it does require an ability to understand humanity and what it is to be a human being, and the kind of right relations elements. You know, any organisation is just a bundle of human beings relating to each other, either in a healthy way or an unhealthy way, and frequently there's lots of tensions and dysfunction that comes around that. So to help organisations change, or leaders to lead, I think this is where the kind of healing element, the multitasking element of all of that is required, and often doesn't exist in organisations that are very much held by the patriarchy, even if they're led by a woman. It's part of a much wider system where the patriarchal thinking is in the system, and it can be really hard for people to break out of that. So,
absolutely.
Well-being, amazing organisations have realised they employ people, and that well-being really matters. And I think perhaps that's where we see some of the patriarchy being challenged now. There's a genuine need to become far more attentive to the needs of people.
For sure, for sure, and that it works well for the individual as well as the organisation to have healthy, happy people working within their sphere. It's just common sense, really.
Yeah, and they have a life beyond work. Well, how amazing is that? They've always had a life beyond work.
It's the difference between living to work and working to live, isn't it?
Completely.
So, over the years when you were more based in the corporate world before you started to bring in your artistic work, was it challenging to be in organisations that had that very fixed patriarchal way of doing things? And what did you encounter?
I at the time, I probably didn't realise what I was engaging with. If I go back to, I began work in the early 80s, and initially I worked in retail management, then I worked in insurance, and then I moved into IT. IT organisations, by their very nature, tend to be populated with men, and they are very process oriented. And I started to struggle with having to adapt my own thinking in order to fit their view of the world. Learned a lot about being able to break something down into its constituent parts of the elements of it, but it was quite taxing on me to force myself into a very rational, logical mindset. And I suppose that's when I started to become aware that there was something else that I was bringing in how I approached situations or people. And as I kind of grew my career and moved into more senior roles, to then, as everybody thinks, surely they know what's happening. Well, to discover that they actually haven't got a clue was quite a wake-up call. But to be a woman in a man's world, I was often the only person in the room who was female, be that an executive team or a wider audience. I can remember going to a kind of in-house conference session. There were 400 people in this room. And as I walked towards it, the finance director was coming towards me. He said, "Are you going to be okay in there?" And I was like, "What do you mean? It's a room full of men, Lynn." And I was like, oh, okay. Of course I'll be fine. So that stuck with me, and that, you know, that's from about 1997. That he was aware that I was going to be the only woman in the room. And I think it's as I've done my own work and my own personal development, and also society's moved on quite a lot. You might not think it has, but over the last 20 years, it has moved on quite a lot. And you know, the talk of masculine and feminine and their energies and the archetypes moves more into everyday language. I have become much more consciously aware of those different energies. And it is interesting to see how some women do adopt that, you know, of becoming the woman in a man's world. In order to play the game, you kind of have to be a bit of a chameleon sometimes to adopt it. And for me to both play that game and sit outside of it, to be both in it but not of it, to be able to observe it and, you know, work with it, and at the same time to challenge it. And so as I became more influential in my role and held more senior positions, my willingness and ability to challenge and to say this is not right. And there are occasions where I have literally stood firm in front of very senior people and board members and refused to do something. I think this is where the warrior element comes up. And I can remember somebody saying to me many, many years ago that I was somebody who would fight lions in the name of justice.
How wonderful. What a compliment.
And at the time I was like, really? But I can see how that's happened on occasion, either because I'm in my role as an HR practitioner representing an individual who's not been treated well, and to have the voice to actually speak up and speak out and speak truth to power. And I think that's a kind of Athena attribute.
It is. And it, you know, the speaking truth, as you said it, I was seeing it slightly differently. It's like we're speaking truth to the false power, and that in itself is powerful to do that, isn't it? But it takes a lot of courage to do that, particularly if you're a lone figure within that patriarchal setup. But thankfully, like you've said, things are changing. People are more aware in terms of the masculine and feminine interchange with synergy within us as individuals. And perhaps in some fields, maybe the more creative fields, perhaps, you know, there is more of a welcome for both perspectives. You know, as you've been speaking, I've been thinking about politics, and I don't particularly want to go down that road in terms of our conversation, because we've already done that actually before we started recording. But, you know, that in itself, we can see how women who've stood out in politics have had to become, or have chosen to become, that you know, the role of the patriarchy. They've actually taken that role. Whereas now I can see that changing in women in those kind of roles, that they're doing it from a different place within themselves, from a different truth within themselves.
Yeah.
So let's look at the creative aspects. So I'm going to read a little bit more from the book now, and then we can share some more of your journey. Okay, so I see the Athena archetype was a bridge to the change towards patriarchy. She's also a bridge towards an evolutionary shift unfolding now, our response and reaction to it, and the process of yet another evolutionary leap taking place. At that time, i.e. the Greek time, Athena held the potential of the evolution, bringing not only reason, but consciousness to the ocean of irrational feeling, intuitive knowing, and instinct sensing womanhood that had been dominant before. Athena represented a point of change expressed through the denial of the feminine as it was known then. The male was becoming dominant, as was masculine linear goal orientation. Yet perhaps this was an essential change in terms of evolution, like the pendulum swinging from one point to its opposite before the falling into balance. Feminists have denounced Athena as a traitor to her own gender, and yet perhaps her role had a function on a much larger scale than has been recognised. For Athena is a major archetype in the evolution of human intelligence from instinctual and intuitive to conscious. Her holistic intelligence is needed particularly at our current point of evolution as we navigate the play of both instinct and consciousness, dark and light frequencies at play in ourselves and our world. And we can really see how, you know, instinct is suddenly, because of our collective circumstance at the moment, you know, the instinctual reactions and responses are very strong at the moment. But I want to talk to you now about your creative work. So describe yourself as an artist. I'm going to give you that open invitation.
Thank you. I always say art found me. I wasn't seeking to become an artist, and I wasn't a practicing artist. I had a breakdown. So I think so much of the stuff we've been talking about, Cassandra, has kind of led me to this moment of collapse and a kind of big inner journey. I'd always been fascinated by mandalas, and as I recovered, I wanted to explore their meaning and how to make them. And in doing that, I found my own niche as an artist without realising it. So I'm a visual artist, so I work primarily with watercolour. I have done some work on canvas with acrylics, but it's mainly watercolour. And I work with sacred geometry, both to create mandala patterns and also to work with what's called Islamic pattern. So if anyone has been to southern Spain or Morocco and seen the tiling, that's actually what I'm referring to, is to work with the geometry of those patterns and create them. And they all have huge symbolic meaning, and there's a lot of numerology that sits behind them as well because of the numbers that are involved in making those patterns. So that's what I've been working with for 6 or 7 years now.
Would you like to share one?
Here's what I prepared earlier.
The Blue Peter moment.
The Blue Peter moment. So let's see if that's coming up on the screen.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, you can see that beautifully. It's wonderful.
So that's acrylics on canvas. And this pattern is known as the Taurus Pattern. So this is actually the energy field of our body.
Wonderful.
So again, it's quite a common pattern in sacred geometry.
And, you know, one of the aspects of Athena is her pattern recognition intelligence, and how actually, you know, everything that seems to be fluid and flowing, there is a sacred geometric structure behind the whole of life, behind, you know, and also including astrology and many of the esoteric arts. So, you know, artists hold that goal, I see, hold that process of flow, which is very much part of, you may have a goal to create a painting or a piece of sculpture or whatever, but actually, you know, you allow the process to take you as well as you guiding the process. So there's this holistic way of being in that for me is very different from that patriarchal, separative kind of, the goal is out there and I'm going to make it happen, you know, whatever it takes. And of course, I'm using extremes to describe it. So just briefly, you know, looking at, let's describe the different kinds of intelligence as head or head with heart. You know, has that been something that you've journeyed with through your life?
Absolutely. I've been very head-based in the corporate world. I don't know if you can hear the banging, they're doing something next door. But the heart's always been there, and I think it's probably in the last 10 years or so, and particularly since I became unwell, that illness, I believe, was a message from the heart, and to a reminder to pay attention that me and everyone else in the world is more than a brain on a stick. And to allow the heart and the heart energy and the heart wisdom to guide me and to make choices from the heart. And I can remember I did a kind of a 2-day introduction to shamanism type workshop, and the person leading that said, allow the heart to guide you on your choices. The head is to show you how you will then get there. And sometimes I forget, I fall into a place of disconnection from my heart, but it's become easier for me to recognize that I am out of alignment. And because my illness was quite catastrophic and led to some very really tough changes in my life, because I lost my job, I lost my house, I didn't work for 18 months. Yet the power of that was it brought creativity and art into my life, and it's taught me how to learn to live slow and to allow space and to allow time, because for my experience of the heart is it's often a whisper. Yeah, we have to be still, we have to be in quietness, or I do. And since moving to Eastbourne and living by the sea, I can take myself off onto a walk by the sea and just sit with the ocean and kind of move into that more contemplative and meditative state, which is where I also create my art from.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, beautiful. And how, something that in its initial stages, can seem and feel really traumatic, that place of everything falling apart and loss. But if we can go with it, it always does birth a gift. And it's like you say, art found you and perhaps was your savior.
Yes.
In that, and you were wise enough to stop and listen.
Yeah. And life forced me. I was literally flat on my back. There was no way I was going to be getting in the car or driving to work, and just being able to do the washing up was a big event. I was completely burnt out. But through that breakdown, it's the story of the breakthrough, and being forced to pay attention and kind of go on the descent. And I think, well, what a gift. It came about in a very unpleasant way, but the gift of that descent and coming through the other side, and that kind of sense of a rebirth and a much better understanding of who I am in the world and how I want to be in the world. It's extremely powerful.
Yeah, very, very, very potent to travel through the darkness.
Yes.
To where, in my perspective, the darkness is where the power sits that enables us then to reach for, the next phase of our growth, the next level of consciousness, the next frequency of light that is there ready for us to align with.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to bring this to completion with a little bit more about Athena. And this section of my book is called The Whole Picture. It's part of that section. The Greeks viewed Athena as the voice of reason and strategy. She was her father's daughter in the main, compliant to his worldview mainly. To the ancients, the Athena archetype is rooted in serpent wisdom, right brain intelligence, rooted in the mystery, which is exactly what we've just been speaking about. In truth, her perception is the whole picture, or as much of it as one has the capacity to perceive at any one time. That is where we are evolving now, in my view. Athena is connected to the vision or goal and the multifaceted strands that may bring it to life. Her intelligence is like the web of connections through the brain, yet it's also a frequency receiver that expands way beyond the brain. In an individual's life, it's an ever-expanding subtle awareness of oneself and one's choices at the center of one's web of life. All its creation is laid out on that web, whilst also interlinking with the whole web. Like the universe, where's the edge? Just like a spider's web, one touch on any part of the individual web activates change in the whole of one's life, whilst also affecting elements within the wider web. Everything has influence or impact, and that's just looking at it in 2 dimensions. What about the influence of our unseen dimensions, our thoughts, our prayers, or our soulfulness? As you may see, Athena is a multifaceted goddess, yet every aspect plays through intelligence.
Yeah, that really.
Sorry, go on.
I say that whole paragraph really speaks to me.
Yeah, it's profound, isn't it? Because I see also that we are in that evolutionary web. That's why she is so important, our understanding of her and of ourselves and where we operate from within that our own web and that wider web is so vital, particularly in these times of incredible evolution.
Yeah.
So
it's no coincidence that I draw patterns, or
exactly,
because I am connecting all the time, and whether it's sacred geometry or Islamic pattern, which the practitioners of that would also describe it as sacred geometry, because it's connecting the creator and the viewer to the divine, and it's the divine order of number across the cosmos. And again, it's no coincidence. I've just read a book called The Human Cosmos, and how over the centuries we've become disconnected from the stars.
Yeah.
This is kind of where I am at, within myself, as the cosmos within us, the constellation of selves within us.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there's so many fields of exploration of that and of discovery in that. Yeah, it's an amazing time to be alive.
It is.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Yeah.
Wish you well in your new adventure with your art and coaching.
Yeah, thank you, Cassandra.
Thank you.